So my subject today is not to eat the panacea, the possible option to achieve longevity. And what is very important is, of course, and that's why we have VegMed, we are convinced that to eat right is the best way to avoid disease. But we have to remind that eating and digestion is a very, very complex task for the body. In fact, independently of what we eat, in the first place, every food, single item, is a foreign body for the body. We digest it, and it is a huge immunological and inflammatory response that accompanies every digestive process. And so it's not weird, and it's quite clear that if we, in any way, if we reduce this task for the body, there should be some health advantage. And the other question is fasting or caloric restriction, is there an intersection with vegan diet, with vegetarian diet? Is there a common trunk, not only in the mechanism, but also maybe in the practical translation for our patients? And as you might anticipate, the question is, yes, there is a common trunk, and I would like to present the data behind that. So, and one reason why it seems to be, in a global view, healthy to restrict calories, to restrict intake is, it's a clear fact, a large part of the world today just practice overeating. We are eating too many calories, independently what type, but it's just too much. And we know that overeating has a lot of consequences, mainly cardiovascular disease. We heard diabetes, also Alzheimer, the multiple sclerosis maybe, and even Parkinson, and a lot of inflammatory diseases. And so these are the choices: a reduced lifespan by disease, maybe the average lifespan, or a maximum lifespan. And this is what science tells us to date, that if we practice any type of dietary restriction, and I will go more into the details which type of dietary restriction seems optimum, but this is the summary where you see it is the same list that we have here where we may produce benefits. And it is clear that if we summarize the research for the last 3 decades, we don't have that much observations from human studies. This starts only since about 10 years, but we know it's a clear, consistent, and homogeneous effect that is in any species, from bacteria, from yeast to monkeys, to all animals, that if they eat less, they live longer and they are less diseased. That is very, very clear. Here, the only question mark a little bit is still with humans. We don't have trials in humans that have an endurance of 50 years or 60 years to really answer the question, will people that practice fasting or caloric restriction achieve an age of above 100 or not? We will know that in some decades. Yeah, but coming back to fasting and caloric restriction, beside the medical question, the scientific question, it has a long tradition in human mankind, in culture, in religion, and in spiritual contexts. As you will know, this is just a selection. We have fasting periods in Christianity. In India, we have Ramadan, which will start soon, a form of intermittent fasting. And all over the world, we know that any shamanistic ritual, initiation rituals are mainly accompanied by fasting periods starting some days before. This is just very common. And on the other side, we have a medical history, a tradition, even starting with the school of Hippocrates, but also the traditional Chinese medicine. You always will find quotes that we should eat 1/3 less than how we feel hungry, or 25%, or that we sometimes should completely renounce or should skip meals. You will find that in all traditional medical systems. In Europe, it was about 80 years ago or 100 years ago when it started to get really implemented in naturopathy, in complementary medicine, that fasting cures were recommended to treat patients. And now we have the nice situation that modern research approaches what we have done in traditional European medicine the last decades. But what is fasting and caloric restriction? When we look at the experimental research, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the working groups of Hollisey in St. Louis, or the Biosphere, as you may know, Roy Walford, they always proposed an energy reduction of 30 to 40%. There's also a group in the United States, they practice this everyday caloric restriction. They are called the Kroners, Caloric Restriction Optimum Diet. They are very skinny, in fact. Yeah? So they don't have high proportions of diabetes, and they are quite healthy. They look very skinny. That maybe sometimes also a little bit shocking. And then we have fasting. We have prolonged fasting. It may be up to 40 days, like in the Bible. I know a lot of patients, I don't recommend 40 days of fasting, but I know that a lot of people are appealed to say, oh yes, I do it like it is written in the Bible, I will fast for 40 days. In fact, when they succeed, then they see very good results, but I think it's a little bit too long. We have water-only fasting, we have juice fasting, the method by Buchinger, as many of you will know, where you have an intake of 300 calories a day by juice or by a vegetable broth. Maybe 400, but you should not go over 500, because then you stop lipolysis from the liver, which is the basis for the different metabolism in fasting. Then we have short-term fasting in oncology at this time. We have now very, very popular in Great Britain, 2 to 5 fasting. It was boosted by the BBC journalist Max Muesli. He wrote a book, Eat Fast and Live Longer. At this time, I can say from our experience also with patients, I think it's much easier to have a period of 1 week fasting 2 times a year than to fast every week 2 days. From a social point of view, it's not so easy to, if you are invited or if you have a family, to say, yeah, on, let's say, Sunday or Saturday and Sunday, I fast, or Monday and Tuesday. It's a little bit strict. But maybe for some people, they are inclined to do that, and then it's a healthy thing. What is also important, we had invited Professor Longo. He's one of the proponents of fasting research in December here in Berlin at Charité. And from his experiments, we asked him, what do you think is the most important thing we should do every day to eat healthy? And he said, you should every day have a 16 hours break of eating. So the best would be to have only 2 meals a day, and maybe these 2 meals in a distance from 6 hours or 7 hours, and then to have a break of 16 or 18 hours. This is the best for the digestive system and for the immunological system to recover from the burden of digestion, as I said already. But the question is intermittent fasting and caloric restriction the same regarding health? Yes, it seems to be the same. And as I told, caloric restriction is, it's not such a funny thing. So intermittent fasting might be more attractive. And these are data where you see intermittent fasting. Here's glucose, here's insulin, and here are the caloric restriction populations. Intermittent fasting compares very nicely, but even better than caloric restriction. And this is also shown in this picture. And there's a lot of data that show, yes, intermittent fasting and caloric restriction are two possibilities with almost the same effects. And what we know, and this comes back to the first slide, yes, life is prolonged if, here is shown by the different animal data, if intermittent fasting is part of the life. This is all, and to remind you that so far there is no other medical intervention, no single intervention for which it has been shown to prolong life. What we see with very good medical support, with surgery, with medication is always we can prolong the health span, but genetically we have to die, the majority between 75 and 90. And this is the only intervention so far that shows that the lifespan can be prolonged and increased. But there are also some clinical effects for fasting. I will go through it quickly. You see, fasting leads to an immediate blood pressure reduction, about 20 points. Here, data from a known study of our group, also 20 points. And this is very nice for patients because sometimes, we saw them, we heard Dr. Barnett and it was stimulating, but sometimes we know that in practical medicine, effects need a longer time. And for our patients, sometimes it's very impressive when they start fasting and they say, wow, it's the third day of fasting, my blood pressure drops 30 or 40 points. I can get rid of the medication. So psychologically, it's a very strong effect because fasting is so powerful in the first days. This is rheumatoid arthritis, a very interesting study, now almost over 25 years old, but still true, where Michalsen and his co-workers, they combined fasting over 10 days, followed by a vegan gluten-free diet for 4 months, and then by a lacto-vegetarian diet. And as you see, the effects on pain or morning stiffness of the joints or tender joints was maintained over 13 months. The problem with this study is we don't know how would it have been with only lacto-vegetarian diet. Was gluten-free the first 3 months important or not? We would have needed more comparative study arms to answer these questions. We don't know. We just can say that fasting combined with a vegan diet produced excellent results for patients with rheumatic inflammation, with rheumatic arthritis. And this is very exciting what Walter Longo did the last years. He showed us that if you perform fasting during treatment of a cancer, you may reduce the side effects of chemotherapy. We replicated these findings that were first done in animals here in a human study, and you see a clear effect. Here is quality of life maintained when you do fasting during chemotherapy, and decreases when patients have a regular diet during chemotherapy. And here also a nice study from Ms. Kaliova. She is now in Loma Linda. She showed us when we reduce in diabetes from 6 meals per day to 2 meals a day, now I'm coming back to meal skipping, we have a bunch of very beneficial effects here on HbA1c, on C-peptide. So again, it seems here useful. So when we look at the physiology, at the mechanisms behind the beneficial effects of fasting, there is a long list. You see insulin decreases, leptin, and this seems to be very important, IGF-1. Here also from Luigi Fontana, where you see IGF-1 is indicated here several times. We suppose that the reduction in IGF-1 has a prominent role in translating these beneficial effects. And so I come to the last point of my presentation. So what will vegan diet or vegetarian diet do in this context? And there are 3 points to make. The first point is a plant-based diet is always a diet with a reduced energy density. And I've shown this slide yesterday. You see when people start a vegan diet with the purpose of reducing weight or not, they will lose weight. It is because of the reduced energy density. So it is a very mild form of dietary restriction. The other point is, some of the effects of fasting seem to be only related to the restriction of protein intake. I think it was always said it is methionine, which seems to be responsible for a lot of the damaging effects on the cell. And methionine is mainly in meat and milk. And so the restriction on animal protein seems to be partly responsible for the whole effect of dietary restriction, which was shown by Luigi Fontana. And these data you see, if you have a low-calorie group that consumes animal-based protein and compare them to a group that has low protein, it compares very beneficially, and here predominantly for IGF-1. So we can't say is it 50% or 30% or 70%, but the protein restriction seems to be important. And here it was a first epidemiological study also done by Walter Longo and his groups, and it's not very easy to see here, but especially in people aged below 65, there's a clear advantage regarding mortality from chronic disease, from cardiovascular disease, if animal protein intake is reduced. And this is a suggestion now from Luigi Fontana, where he says, well, if we are promoting longevity, it seems we have reduced calorie intake as one step, and we have reduced animal protein intake as a second step. Of course, we also have exercise, mental health, but we can maybe divide into 2 nutritional principles. And this is the last point I want to make. And coming back to the clinical, to the practical side of fasting, what we always see is fasting brings good mood. People have very good mood in fasting. Maybe they feel hungry the first day, sometimes the third day, but in fact, there is a clear mood enhancement visible. And this for us is psychological, a very nice situation to enhance, to support lifestyle modification. As we know, it is very, very difficult to change nutritional habits for our patients. Most fail, and again, when we have this initial experience, it works like a reset button. So people don't forget that they said, well, it is the first time in my life I'm eating nothing or mainly nothing, and I feel great. And this makes them reflecting that maybe the way they ate did not contribute to their well-being generally. And so they are capable to change their nutritional habits because they believe and they experience that it has a great impact. And so here we found in our own data that depression and anxiety and hostility were largely reduced in the course of a fasting cure, and we summarized this also in a paper. So what are my conclusions? Fasting appears clearly effective in the prevention and treatment of diseases. I know that we need more data, but if we summarize also the experimental data, it's clear, very, very consistent. And I think I have no doubt that the next years we will see more and more data showing us that fasting and caloric restriction are healthy. And it is very interesting that we may say a part of the fasting effect can be achieved by a vegan diet, or at least by not eating animal protein. I don't know, we don't know which part, I repeat, but clearly it's the best combination. Yeah. And if we think about the data from Michalsen, why not combining it also in other inflammatory chronic diseases, starting a fasting cure followed by a vegan or a lacto-vegetarian diet? And this is also very important. Fasting for me is the ideal promoter of a nutritional lifestyle change. So at least in Europe, I heard from Walter Longo, in the United States, it's not so easy. People think, oh, fasting, well, this is very, very very strange and get a little bit anxious. But here in Europe, with the tradition of fasting, we see that people love it and like it. And so I would endorse that combination. And thanks for listening.